let me walk everyone through a few times when we've had to implement scenario planning across different organizations that I've been in. Uh, I would say what I've put in this slide is really the big ones, or what we call the black swan events. I think a lot of us go through small scenarios. What happens if this changes or that assumption changes. But I thought I'd talk through some of the big events that have happened over the last few years and how do we think about it. So I would say the biggest one that's happened in the recent past has really been COVID. And I think the challenge with COVID was it just caused so many different dimensions in terms of what could change or what could go wrong that I don't know that it wasn't an easy scenario to run. I think the organization I was in at that time ran it pretty well, and I think we covered it well. But as you go through, you see that, oh, I should have thought through this driver. I should have thought through X, Y, and Z linkage to economic scenarios and so on. So I would say of all the scenarios, this one was probably the most challenging to run. I would say the next one was really the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. At that time, we moved the different economic variables and said, what happens if unemployment goes up? What happens if the Dow falls another 10% or 20%? How does that change things like mark to market? How does it change credit losses? And I think it was really important for us to work through the organization to make sure people thought through event connectivity. So what happens if, when Lehman went under, or when Bear Stearns was going through its challenges? How do you think about mark to market? How do you think about correlations that you might not have thought before? And how do you bring that in with interest rates? And the other one I've been through quite a lot, and sometimes it's pretty ongoing, is what happens with a product success or a product failure. And I think in most cases we do a scenario about what happens if something doesn't happen. In my experience, we've not done too many in terms of success. So if something turns out to be a bigger success than what we thought, how do we pivot? I think in general, management always wants to have a backup plan and a contingency plan to say what happens if things don't go well. How do we pivot? And how do we think about staffing, marketing spend? How do we think about our P&L and so on? And then lastly, I would say the other time things have been really volatile have been in the last 2 or 3 years, especially when the Fed started hiking rates. I think that caused a lot of unexpected correlations in terms of activity levels, in terms of business drivers. So for me, the key in this one was really getting our businesses to think through what are the expected correlations, and also think through some of the unexpected correlations, if you may. Just moving to the next slide, I thought it would be interesting to sort of talk through why do we need scenario planning. Whenever someone's asked me to run a scenario or do something, I've always thought, what is the reason that we're doing this? And I think it's really important that when you're at a senior level and you're the one cascading the scenario through the organization, you think about why we're doing it and you communicate that why really clearly. So to me, the primary reason is really contingency planning. And I know there's a big focus on expenses, but really, if COVID is impacting us, what are the expenses we can cut quickly, for example? I think that's probably the biggest take. Do we put in place, do we stop any hiring for now? How long do we put things on pause? Is there any discretionary expense we can cut? Are we having some events? Do we have travel 6 months out? How much of those can be cut or flex? And then what do you need to be prepared for? And I would say losses. As unemployment ticks up, how do you think about credit losses, for example? I think, and in which areas? I think that's probably one of the things that needs a fair amount of thinking. I would say in each of the scenarios I talked about, they were historically a little different than anything that's happened in the past. So what you need to do is not just think through your regular model, but what are the different possibilities that could happen? And then I would sort of think about the others as how do we think about flexibility? What's the first thing we do? What's the second thing we do? And I think a lot of this is really around organization responsiveness and preparedness. How quickly can we pivot from one scenario to another? How do we move from one decision to another? And then I would say finally, it's really important for us to have a playbook as an organization and to say, okay, if this happens, this happens, this is when I'm going to trigger these actions. I'm going to cut spending. I might decide to raise capital. I might actually decide to dividend if I realize that people aren't borrowing as much and I don't need that capital. So it's really having a playbook that we can respond to if things get better or worse. And then I thought for the next slide, I would just talk about being really practical and saying, if I need to run a scenario, and generally I feel like the bigger the organization, the more complex it is to run scenarios. So if you need to run a scenario, what are the steps you should take, and how do you think through it? I would say my first step really is, and I'd start on the right, which is you need to get senior management ownership. You need the CEO, the CFO to buy into what you're doing, and you need to make sure that they are direct reports and their communication buys into it so that they know why we're doing it, how we're doing it. Not so much the how, but why we're doing it and what results to expect. And then the second consideration I've always had is once I've got CFO, CEO buy-in, is really thinking about, is this something that we can manage in a rolling forecast, or do we need to just run it as a special scenario and keep it on the side? And then I've always thought about the next one really deeply, which is, do we need to keep it centralized or do we need to push it lower level? And personally, having sort of come through the FP&A ranks, I've always had a great affinity towards the lower level, because I know when we think about doing something and we think it's simple, when you push it down the organization, it gets more and more complex. So I've always debated this, at least myself and with our larger team, about how deep do we need to push it. And then I sort of think about the turnaround time. How quickly do we want it? Generally, we do want things very quickly. And then just moving to the left-hand side, just thinking about, do we need to think about it, do we need this data systemic or do we need it offline? I would say if this is a big scenario, if this is a big change, so like COVID, the Great Recession, some of the interest rate changes, products haven't worked out, we do want it to be systemic. I think having it offline in Excel spreadsheets just creates more and more issues as you go through, as time passes. And then finally, I would say, what is the level of detail we need? Do we need to do it at a really detailed level? How do we leverage existing economic and driver-based models? I would say in each of the cases I gave, those are sort of the more black swan events, if you may. So you might want to consider, do your economic and driver-based models cover these scenarios? And then lastly, I would say, I think very clearly that, do I need to give people a very specific guidance? Do I need to tell them, hey, make sure you look at the correlation between unemployment, for example, and credit losses? Or do you need to look at GDP growth versus business activity? So I would always lean on very specific guidance. It need not be formal, but I think informally communicating that these are sort of the changes I would like to see or that we are expecting, I think is really helpful.